Who authorized excavation on private residential property? The county inspector's voice cut through the cool morning air before I had even stepped out of my truck. I followed his stare and felt my stomach drop. Half of my concrete driveway was gone. Fresh dirt stretched across the entrance to my property, broken slabs stacked along the edge like discarded puzzle pieces. A yellow excavator sat idling beside the mailbox while workers in reflective vests stood frozen, looking anywhere except at me. Standing confidently in the middle of it all was Patricia Holloway, the president of our homeowners association, holding a clipboard with the same polished smile she wore every time she handed someone a violation notice. She looked at me as if I should be thanking her. "Good morning, Caleb," she said calmly. "We decided to improve access for the community maintenance vehicles while you were away." Improve access. Those two words echoed in my head as I looked at the driveway I had paid for 12 years earlier with overtime checks, weekend jobs, and more patience than I thought I had. Every inch of that concrete had been poured according to county specifications because the property sat above a complicated drainage system. It was never HOA property. It had never been HOA property. Yet there she stood, speaking as though she owned every square foot. The smell of wet concrete dust mixed with diesel exhaust drifted through the cold morning air. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the inspector. He never took his eyes off Patricia. "Sir," he asked quietly, "did you authorize this excavation?" I answered with one word. "No." Patricia laughed softly, almost amused by the question. "He has been traveling," she interrupted. "The board approved emergency improvements under our maintenance authority." The inspector slowly turned toward her. "Can you show me the county excavation permit?" For the first time, Patricia's smile hesitated, but only for a second. "Our attorney handled the paperwork," she replied with complete confidence. "Everything is perfectly legal." Around us, the workers exchanged nervous glances. One man shut off the excavator. Another quietly climbed down from the machine and folded his arms. Across the street, neighbors began gathering at the edge of their lawns with coffee mugs still in their hands. Cell phones slowly appeared. Nobody said a word. I had only been gone for 3 days attending a construction safety conference in Nashville. Before leaving, I had locked the gate, checked my security cameras, and expected to come home to the peaceful property I had spent over a decade building. Instead, I returned to find my driveway cut open without a phone call, without a letter, without permission. Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice as though she was doing me a favor. "You should really try to be more flexible, Caleb. Communities work better when everyone cooperates." I looked at the inspector instead of answering her. He reached into his truck, removed a thick tablet, and began searching through county records. His expression became noticeably more serious with every swipe across the screen. Then he stopped. He looked directly at Patricia and asked one simple question that instantly changed the atmosphere for everyone standing there. "Ma'am, what permit number would you like me to search under?" Patricia folded her arms as though the question itself was ridiculous. "I do not carry permit numbers," she said with a patient smile. "Our legal team manages administrative filings." The county inspector nodded once without arguing. His calmness unsettled everyone more than an accusation would have. He tapped a few more entries into his tablet, while the only sounds came from the diesel engine cooling beside the torn driveway and the distant chirping of birds in the maple trees lining the street. After nearly 30 seconds of silence, he looked back up. "That is interesting," he said evenly. "I cannot locate any excavation permit associated with this parcel, this homeowners association, or any contractor working at this address during the past 12 months. Patricia's expression barely changed, but I noticed her grip tighten around the clipboard. "Perhaps your system has not updated yet," she answered confidently. "Government databases are slow." The inspector gave a polite smile that revealed nothing. "County excavation permits are issued before work begins, not afterward." One of the contractors quietly cleared his throat. He looked from Patricia to the inspector before speaking. "Ma'am, your office told us all approvals had already been completed." Patricia turned toward him immediately. "Because they were." The contractor hesitated. "We never received copies. We were told everything would be waiting if anyone asked." Across the street, more neighbors drifted outside. Mr. Donnelly still wore his slippers while holding a steaming coffee mug. The Ramirez family stood beside their pickup truck, whispering to each other. Someone lifted a phone just high enough to begin recording. Nobody stepped closer, but nobody walked away either. The inspector glanced toward the excavation site again. Who instructed your crew where to cut? The foreman answered honestly. She did. He pointed directly at Patricia. She met us here yesterday morning with a printed site sketch. Patricia interrupted before anyone else could speak. The board voted unanimously. We are creating better access for maintenance vehicles and emergency equipment. This benefits every homeowner. I finally spoke. Then why was I never notified? She looked at me with practiced patience, almost like a teacher correcting a child. Because you have been difficult in the past, Caleb. We believed you would delay necessary improvements with unnecessary objections. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable looks. They all knew I rarely attended HOA meetings unless absolutely necessary. I paid my dues on time, maintained my property, and generally preferred spending weekends fishing rather than arguing about neighborhood politics. Hearing Patricia describe me as an obstacle sounded strangely familiar, as though she had already rehearsed the story long before I returned home. The inspector slowly walked toward the exposed trench running beneath what had once been my driveway. He crouched beside it, brushing loose soil away with the tip of his glove. A strip of bright orange utility marking tape became visible beneath the dirt. He stood immediately. Who contacted utility location services before excavation? Complete silence answered him. Even the contractor looked confused. Patricia blinked once before replying. That responsibility belongs to the contractor. The foreman shook his head. No, ma'am. Property owners or authorized applicants request utility clearance before we dig. We were told the request had already been completed. The inspector let out a slow breath and entered another note into his tablet. Then he reached for the radio attached to his shoulder. Dispatch, he said calmly. I need verification on utility locate requests for this address, and I am also requesting an engineering supervisor respond to the site. Patricia's confident smile finally disappeared completely. She stared at the inspector as though the situation had somehow slipped beyond the script she had written in her own mind. The engineering supervisor arrived 20 minutes later in a White County pickup with mud splashed along the lower doors and a stack of rolled survey maps tucked behind the passenger seat. His name badge read Daniel Brooks, and unlike everyone else gathered around the damaged driveway, he looked more interested in the ground than in the growing argument. He shook hands with the inspector, listened without interrupting, then walked directly toward the exposed trench carrying a measuring wheel and a weathered clipboard. Patricia stepped forward before anyone else could speak. I am glad you are here, she said with renewed confidence. This project has already been delayed enough. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he measured the distance from the curb to the excavation, compared it against a printed parcel map, then crouched near the orange utility markings. He brushed away another layer of loose soil and quietly nodded to himself. I recognized that look. It was the expression of someone whose observations already disagreed with the story he had been given. The morning sun had burned away the last of the fog, leaving the scent of fresh earth and wet cedar drifting through the neighborhood. More residents gathered along the sidewalk. A delivery truck slowed almost to a stop before continuing down the street. Nobody wanted to miss what was unfolding. Daniel finally stood and faced Patricia. Who instructed the crew to excavate exactly along this alignment? Patricia answered immediately. I did. It follows the existing driveway. Daniel looked back at the trench. No, it does not. The words landed with surprising weight. He pointed toward a thin metal survey monument barely visible near the edge of the lawn. The original driveway was intentionally offset several feet from the utility corridor. Whoever designed this knew exactly what they were doing. I smiled quietly because I remembered that conversation from 12 years earlier. When my driveway was first built, the county engineer had insisted on shifting its alignment after discovering an underground drainage easement and multiple utility crossings beneath the original path. It had cost me extra money at the time, but I followed every recommendation without complaint. Patricia had lived in the neighborhood back then, but she had not yet become HOA president. She had never bothered to learn why my driveway looked slightly different from everyone else's. Daniel continued reviewing the survey documents while the inspector compared notes on his tablet. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel asked, do you happen to have copies of your original construction records? I nodded. Every permit, every inspection report, every engineering revision is stored in my home office. Patricia quickly interrupted. Those records are outdated. Neighborhood infrastructure evolves. Daniel slowly turned toward her. County drainage easements do not evolve without engineering approval. His tone remained calm, but the sentence carried enough authority that nobody challenged him. The contractor's foreman removed his hard hat and rubbed the back of his neck. "Sir," he admitted, "if there is a drainage easement under this excavation, we should not have broken ground until engineering signed off." Daniel nodded once. "That is correct." The inspector's radio suddenly crackled to life. Dispatch confirmed there had been no utility locate request submitted for my property within the legally required time frame. The inspector thanked them, clipped the radio back onto his shoulder, and looked directly at Patricia. She no longer stood with the relaxed posture she had displayed earlier that morning. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the contractors before returning to the county officials. Daniel carefully rolled up the survey map and spoke in the same measured voice he had used since arriving. "Before another shovel touches this property, I need to know exactly who represented to these contractors that county approval had already been granted." Nobody answered Daniel's question right away. The silence stretched long enough for the breeze to carry the smell of freshly turned soil across the neighborhood. Finally, Patricia lifted her chin and spoke with the same polished confidence she had relied on for years. "The board approved the project. As president, I authorized the work. That is all the contractor needed." Daniel did not argue. He simply wrote her statement down word for word. "Thank you," he replied. "I appreciate clear answers." The contractor's foreman shifted uneasily beside the excavator. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "our contract packet included a signed authorization letter from the Homeowners Association. We assumed the county paperwork had already been completed because that is what we were told during the planning meeting." Patricia immediately turned toward him. "Because that was the understanding." The foreman frowned. Understanding and documentation are not always the same thing. That single sentence changed the mood. Until then, everyone had spoken as though this was simply a disagreement between a homeowner and the association. Now it sounded like several people were realizing they had relied on assumptions instead of verified approvals. Daniel asked to see the contractor's paperwork. The foreman retrieved a thick folder from the cab of his pickup and handed it over. Daniel flipped through each page slowly. There was a signed work authorization from the HOA. There was a payment schedule approved by the board treasurer. There was a site sketch with Patricia's handwritten notes marking exactly where the excavation should begin. What was missing stood out immediately. There was no county permit attached, no engineering approval, no utility clearance, no inspection schedule. Daniel closed the folder and handed it back without a word. The county inspector looked toward me. "Mr. Whitmore, would you be willing to show us your construction records?" "Of course," I answered. "Everything is organized by year." We walked inside my garage, which still smelled faintly of cedar shelving, motor oil, and the coffee I had brewed before leaving for Nashville 3 days earlier. I unlocked a gray metal filing cabinet tucked beside my workbench and pulled out a binder labeled Driveway Construction. Every permit, inspection report, engineering revision, invoice, and survey drawing remained exactly where I had placed them over a decade earlier. Daniel carefully reviewed the documents one by one. His attention stopped on a folded engineering plan stamped by the county. He spread it across my workbench. Bright blue lines showed the underground drainage easement running beneath part of the front yard, while a red line marked the exact approved alignment of my driveway. Daniel tapped the map gently with his finger. "Here it is," he said. The driveway was intentionally moved 6 feet west to protect both the drainage structure and the utility corridor. The inspector leaned over the drawing and quietly nodded. "Which means today's excavation crossed directly into the protected zone." Outside, I could hear more vehicles arriving along the street. Curious neighbors continued gathering while someone whispered that another county truck had entered the subdivision. Patricia remained near the damaged driveway, speaking into her phone in increasingly hurried sentences. Her calm smile had vanished. She paced slowly across the sidewalk, stopping every few moments to glance toward my house, as if hoping the officials would emerge with different conclusions. Instead, Daniel carefully closed the binder, handed it back to me, and looked directly at the inspector. "Based on these original county records, I believe this excavation may have disturbed protected infrastructure without authorization. We need to suspend every activity immediately until a full engineering review is completed." The county inspector walked back toward the excavation and pulled a bright orange stop work notice from his truck. Without raising his voice or creating unnecessary drama, he fastened it to the temporary construction fence with 2 plastic ties. The paper fluttered lightly in the morning breeze, but its message could not have been clearer. Every machine shut down. Every worker stepped away from the trench. The neighborhood fell unusually quiet, broken only by birds in the oak trees and the occasional sound of a passing pickup on the county road beyond our subdivision. Patricia stared at the notice as if it had appeared by mistake. "This is completely unnecessary," she insisted. "We were improving community infrastructure." The inspector remained professional. "At this moment, I am not evaluating your intentions. I am evaluating compliance." Daniel Brooks slowly circled the excavation one more time, taking photographs from several angles with a county-issued camera. He documented the exposed utility markings, the broken concrete, the disturbed drainage path, and the survey monument near the property line. Every photograph carried a timestamp. Every measurement went into his notebook. Watching him work reminded me of the engineers who had supervised the original construction years earlier. They had followed procedures because underground infrastructure could affect far more than a single driveway. Daniel eventually stopped beside me. "Mr. Whitmore," he asked, "have you experienced drainage problems here since the driveway was built?" "Never," I answered honestly. "Even during heavy spring storms, water always flowed exactly where the engineers intended." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That consistency usually means the original design solved an existing problem. Altering it without review creates unnecessary risk." Patricia stepped closer again. "Risk is being exaggerated," she said firmly. "Nothing underground has been damaged." Daniel looked at her calmly. "We do not know that yet, which is precisely why excavation requires engineering approval before work begins." The contractor's foreman quietly approached the officials holding another folder. "There is something else you should probably see," he admitted. Inside was the email chain his company had received before accepting the project. Daniel reviewed the correspondence carefully. Most messages discussed scheduling, equipment access, and payment milestones. Then one sentence caught his attention. It came from Patricia herself. The message read, "Do not worry about county delays. I have already handled everything on my end." Daniel read the sentence twice before showing it to the inspector. Neither man commented immediately. They simply saved copies using a portable scanner carried inside the county truck. The foreman looked genuinely uncomfortable. "If we had known permits were still pending, we would never have started excavation," he said. "Company policy does not allow it." Across the street, several neighbors quietly exchanged surprised looks. Mr. Donnelly slowly shook his head, while Mrs. Ramirez whispered something to her husband before pointing toward Patricia. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier that morning, many residents had assumed this was another ordinary disagreement between the HOA president and a homeowner. Now they were watching county officials gather documents that suggested something much more serious. Patricia noticed the shifting mood almost immediately. She stopped speaking into her phone and began walking from neighbor to neighbor, attempting friendly conversations that ended almost as quickly as they started. People who normally greeted her politely now seemed more interested in watching the county investigation unfold. The inspector finally closed his tablet and turned toward Daniel. "Engineering review, permit verification, utility clearance failure, and documented written representations," he summarized quietly. Daniel agreed with a slow nod before looking directly at Patricia once more. "Ma'am, before this goes any further, I strongly recommend you tell us exactly when you first decided county approval was no longer necessary." Patricia took a slow breath before answering, as though choosing the right words could somehow restore control of the situation. "No one said county approval was unnecessary," she replied. "We simply believe this qualified as routine maintenance under the association's authority." Daniel did not react immediately. He opened another folder inside his truck and removed a printed copy of the county engineering code. Turning several pages, he stopped and placed his finger on a highlighted paragraph. "Routine maintenance preserves existing infrastructure," he explained calmly. "Excavation that removes structural concrete and alters the supporting base is classified as reconstruction. Reconstruction requires engineering review, utility clearance, and county authorization before any work begins." Patricia looked toward the remaining board members who had quietly arrived during the investigation. Treasurer Michael Harper stood near the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact. Board Secretary Linda Foster stared at the damaged driveway with growing concern. Neither one stepped forward to support Patricia. Daniel noticed their presence and addressed them directly. Were either of you informed that no county permit had been issued? Michael hesitated before answering. We assumed everything had already been approved because Patricia told us the paperwork was complete. Linda nodded slowly. That is what we were told during the board meeting as well. Patricia turned sharply toward them. You are taking my comments out of context. Michael shook his head. No, Patricia. You specifically said county approval had already been handled. The words hung heavily in the warm afternoon air. Several neighbors exchanged surprised glances. For years, Patricia had controlled every meeting with absolute confidence, rarely allowing anyone to question her decisions. Now members of her own board were quietly separating themselves from her version of events. The county inspector continued documenting statements without interruption. Every response was recorded with the time and the speaker's name. The process felt methodical, almost quiet, but each answer seemed to move the investigation one step further away from misunderstanding and one step closer to accountability. Daniel asked another question. Who selected the exact excavation path? Patricia answered more cautiously this time. I reviewed the contractor's proposal. The foreman immediately corrected her. Actually, ma'am, our original proposal followed the existing driveway alignment. You instructed us to shift the trench toward the east side because you wanted additional room for larger maintenance vehicles. Daniel looked down at the engineering survey still resting on the hood of the county truck. The east side is exactly where the protected drainage corridor begins. The foreman slowly removed another folded document from his folder. I almost forgot, he admitted. This is the revised site sketch we received after that meeting. Daniel unfolded the paper beside the official county survey. The difference was impossible to ignore. Someone had drawn a bold red line across the revised sketch, redirecting the excavation several feet away from the original driveway and directly over the protected utility corridor. In the lower corner sat Patricia's initials beside the handwritten instruction, proceed with revised access route. Daniel photographed both drawings side by side before placing them into separate evidence envelopes. The inspector quietly requested certified copies from the contractor. Around us, conversations among the neighbors grew noticeably quieter. Even people who had defended Patricia in previous disputes now watched in complete silence. She looked across the gathering crowd as though expecting someone to speak on her behalf, but nobody did. Daniel carefully sealed the envelopes, handed one to the inspector, and spoke with the same measured professionalism he had maintained all day. Based on everything we have documented so far, this no longer appears to be a simple permitting issue. We now need to determine whether inaccurate project information was knowingly provided before excavation began. Daniel's final comment settled over the neighborhood like the heavy air before a summer storm. Patricia opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unsure whether speaking would help or make things worse. The county inspector continued organizing photographs, signed statements, and scanned documents with quiet efficiency. Nothing about the process felt dramatic, yet every page placed into the investigation folder seemed to carry more weight than the last. A second county vehicle rolled into the subdivision and parked behind the engineering truck. The logo on the door belonged to the Department of Public Works. An older engineer named Rebecca Collins stepped out carrying a utility locator and a weathered field notebook. Daniel greeted her with a brief summary before handing over copies of the original construction plans and the revised excavation sketch. Rebecca listened carefully without interrupting anyone. She walked directly to the trench, activated the locator, and slowly moved it across the exposed ground. The device emitted a steady electronic tone that changed pitch several times as she followed invisible utility lines beneath the soil. Every few feet, she placed a small colored flag beside the trench. Red, blue, orange, yellow. Within minutes, the excavation site looked completely different. The colored markers revealed just how many underground systems crossed beneath the area Patricia had ordered the contractor to dig through. Rebecca finally stood and removed her safety glasses. The original engineering alignment avoided every one of these crossings, she said. The revised alignment passes directly above multiple protected facilities. Patricia immediately tried to regain control. Nothing was actually damaged. Rebecca answered with remarkable patience. That is fortunate. Compliance exists to keep it that way. The contractor's foreman slowly exhaled. If utility markings had been completed before excavation, we never would have accepted this route. Daniel looked toward him. Did anyone provide your crew with updated engineering drawings? No, the foreman admitted. Only the HOA sketch. Rebecca carefully compared the HOA drawing against the certified county plans. These are not equivalent documents, she explained. One is an engineering record. The other is simply a marked-up copy without technical approval. Even neighbors who knew little about construction seemed to understand the difference. Quiet conversations spread across the sidewalk. Several residents who had once praised Patricia's leadership now looked increasingly uncomfortable. Michael Harper stepped away from the board members and approached Daniel. I believe the board needs copies of everything you have documented today, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. Formal requests can be made through the county records office after today's field report is completed. Michael glanced toward Patricia before speaking again. I do not think everyone understood how this project was actually being handled. Patricia turned toward him in disbelief. Michael, we discussed this together. He answered respectfully, but firmly. We discussed improving access. We never discussed bypassing county engineering requirements. The statement carried through the gathering crowd. Nobody argued with him. Rebecca completed her final measurements, then walked back to Daniel with a serious expression. She pointed to one section of the survey map and then toward the damaged driveway. Daniel studied both for several seconds before looking at the inspector. We have another issue, he said quietly. The excavation appears to extend beyond the homeowner's driveway and into an area protected by a recorded county drainage easement. The inspector slowly closed his notebook and looked directly at Patricia once again. Ma'am, he said evenly, that finding changes the scope of this investigation considerably. The county inspector requested that everyone remain available while the field investigation was completed. Nobody objected. The contractors stayed beside their equipment with the engines off. The board members gathered quietly near the clubhouse entrance, and the neighbors remained scattered along the sidewalks, speaking in voices low enough that only fragments carried through the warm afternoon air. Patricia stood alone near the damaged driveway, still holding the clipboard that had seemed so powerful only a few hours earlier. Now it looked more like something she no longer knew what to do with. Rebecca Collins unfolded another county map across the hood of Daniel's truck. Unlike the construction drawings I had shown them earlier, this one displayed recorded easements, drainage corridors, and maintenance access routes dating back more than 20 years. Daniel traced one blue line with his finger until it reached the edge of my property. There, he said quietly. The protected drainage easement continues beneath this section of the driveway before turning toward the retention basin behind the subdivision. Rebecca nodded. Which means the county retains authority over this corridor regardless of private ownership above it. Patricia immediately stepped closer. Then this is county property, not his driveway. Daniel calmly shook his head. No, the driveway remains private property. The easement only grants limited county access for drainage maintenance. It does not authorize third parties to excavate without engineering approval. Patricia's shoulders dropped slightly as the distinction settled in. She had mistaken the existence of an easement for unrestricted authority, and now county officials were explaining the difference in front of an audience that had watched her present herself as the neighborhood expert for years. Michael Harper quietly removed his board identification badge and slipped it into his pocket. Linda Foster followed a moment later. Neither action was dramatic, but several neighbors noticed immediately. Mr. Donnelly leaned toward another resident and whispered, I have never seen them disagree with her before. The contractor's foreman approached Daniel carrying one final document. Our office just forwarded the signed service agreement, he explained. You may want to review page 4. Daniel opened the packet and stopped almost instantly. The agreement listed the homeowners association as the customer, but one section caught his attention. Under owner authorization, the document certified that all required governmental approvals had already been obtained before excavation. Daniel looked toward the foreman. Who signed this certification? The foreman answered quietly. Patricia Holloway signed it on behalf of the association. Daniel showed the page to the county inspector, who compared the signature with the earlier authorization letter. They matched perfectly. Neither official raised his voice. The inspector simply photographed the page, logged the document into his report, and handed the original back to the contractor. Patricia finally spoke again, though her confidence had faded into frustration. This has become completely unreasonable. We were trying to improve the neighborhood. Daniel answered with the same calm professionalism he had maintained all day. Intent does not replace required approvals. County infrastructure depends on documented procedures because every shortcut creates risk for property owners, contractors, and the public. A light breeze carried the smell of rain drifting in from the west as gray clouds slowly gathered above the tree line. Rebecca packed away her locator equipment while Daniel organized the investigation file into a thick binder. The county inspector closed his tablet and looked first at me, then at Patricia. "The field investigation is complete," he said. "Our preliminary findings will now be forwarded for administrative review, and based on the documentation collected today, the Homeowners Association should prepare for formal county action regarding this excavation." Rain began falling 2 days later, tapping softly against my metal roof while I sat at the same workbench where I had stored every permit and inspection report for more than a decade. By then, the county had officially closed the excavation site, and every piece of heavy equipment had been removed from my property. Bright orange barriers still marked the damaged section of the driveway, but the neighborhood felt strangely quieter than it had in years. 3 business days after the investigation, the Homeowners Association called an emergency board meeting. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, the meeting room was completely full. Folding chairs lined every wall, neighbors stood in the back holding coffee cups, and conversations stopped the moment the board members entered. Patricia walked to the front carrying her familiar binder, but something was different. She no longer carried herself like the unquestioned authority in the room. Michael Harper requested the floor before the meeting even reached the first agenda item. Speaking calmly, he informed everyone that the board had received notice of the county's preliminary findings along with recommendations from the association's legal counsel. Linda Foster then read a prepared statement explaining that the excavation project had not followed required county procedures and that the association would cooperate fully with every administrative review. Patricia interrupted twice, insisting that everything had been done for the benefit of the community, but each interruption was met with longer and longer silence. Nobody argued with her. Nobody applauded her either. The attorney representing the association stood and explained that continuing to defend the excavation could expose the association to unnecessary financial liability. He recommended that the board authorize immediate restoration of my driveway using county-approved engineering plans, reimburse all documented property restoration costs, and fully cooperate with every county request. The motion passed by a unanimous vote after Patricia quietly abstained. 1 week later, professional surveyors returned, this time under county supervision. Utility companies verified every underground line before fresh concrete was poured exactly where the original engineering drawings required. Daniel Brooks stopped by during the final inspection, compared the finished work against the certified plans, and smiled for the first time since I had met him. "Now it matches the approved design," he said before signing the completion report. Rebecca Collins performed one final drainage inspection after a heavy afternoon rain. Water flowed smoothly through the protected corridor exactly as it had for years before the unnecessary excavation. She closed her notebook, nodded once, and told me the county considered the infrastructure restored. Not long afterward, Patricia submitted her resignation as president of the Homeowners Association. No dramatic speeches followed. No angry confrontation took place. A special election was scheduled, and new board members promised to focus on transparency, documented approvals, and communication with residents before making major decisions. As for me, I backed my pickup onto the newly finished driveway one quiet Saturday morning with a fresh cup of coffee resting in the center console. The concrete still carried that clean scent that only new pavement has after a cool overnight rain. Looking across the neighborhood, I realized the most important thing the county restored was not the driveway itself. It was confidence that rules applied equally to everyone, no matter how important they believed they were. Patricia thought authority alone could replace engineering, permits, and property rights. The county reminded everyone that paperwork may not look dramatic, but when it is backed by the law, it is stronger than any clipboard, louder than any meeting, and far more permanent than confidence built on assumptions.